72 years. That's how long the ground under Nevada has been silent. No magnitude 7, no major rupture, just and waiting. Now, in the same corridor where the high desert tore open in Chintrum High, 440 earthquakes have fired off in 17 days, and the 4 biggest ones are breaking a fundamental law of seismology. The math says they shouldn't be that size, and that gap between what should be happening and what actually is, that's the gap seismologists lose sleep over, because the last time this exact pattern showed up in western Nevada, it wasn't background noise, it was a countdown. Tonight I'm going to show you what that countdown looked like and whether we're watching it again right now. Stay with me, you're going to want to see where this goes. Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, make sure to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs. Also, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The signal in the noise. At 1:17 in the morning on May 1st, 2026, something moved beneath the high desert of western Nevada that should not have moved the way it did. Not because earthquakes in Nevada are rare, they are not. Nevada is one of the most seismically active states in the continental United States, and the ground there shifts and groans with a regularity that most residents have simply learned to absorb as background noise. A fact of life in a place built on fault lines. So when the sensors lit up at 1:17 a.m. Pacific time, registering a magnitude 5.2 near Silver Springs in Lyon County, the automatic response from most monitoring systems was essentially a shrug. A 5.2 in Nevada. Log it. Move on. But here is the thing about that 5.2. It was not alone. It had not arrived out of nowhere. It was not the beginning of anything. It was, depending on how you read the data, either the continuation of something that had already been building for 17 days, or it was the most recent warning shot fired by a system that is not finished yet. Let me walk you back to April 14th, 2026. That is the day a magnitude 5.7 earthquake struck near Silver Springs, Nevada. Now, a 5.7 is not a catastrophic event. It rattles windows, knocks things off shelves, puts people's hearts briefly in their throats before they exhale and go back to bed. In the context of Nevada seismicity, a 5.7 is noisy but not extraordinary. The ordinary expectation, the textbook expectation, is that after a 5.7, you get a series of aftershocks that decline in both frequency and magnitude. The ground shivers, releases its tension in smaller and smaller increments, and quiets down. That is how it is supposed to work. That is what Barth's law tells us to expect. Barth's law is one of those beautifully simple rules in seismology. It states that the largest aftershock following a main shock will typically be about 1.2 magnitude units smaller than the main shock itself. So after a 5.7, you expect your largest aftershock to land around 4.5, maybe 4.6, if the system is feeling generous. What you do not expect is a 4.7, and you especially do not expect a 4.7, followed by a 4.8, followed by a 5.2, because those numbers, 5.7, 5.2, 4.8, 4.7, span only one full magnitude unit in 17 days, in the same narrow corridor of Lyon County, Nevada. That is not an aftershock sequence, or if it is the most non-compliant aftershock sequence in recent Nevada history. And that word non-compliant is doing an enormous amount of work in this story. By May 1st, 2026, approximately 440 individual earthquakes had been recorded in this sequence. 440 events in 17 days, clustering along the same narrow zone between Reno and Fallon, Nevada. The region sits in Lyon County, not a name most people outside Nevada would recognize, but a place that is geographically significant in ways we are going to get into. Most of those 440 events were small, magnitude 2, magnitude 3, the kind that instruments catch but human bodies rarely feel. But the top four, the four largest events in this sequence, they are what researchers like Stephen Burns, An independent geoscientist who has been tracking this sequence closely have flagged as statistically unusual. Burns has publicly noted that this pattern is not what a routine aftershock sequence looks like. And here is the important part. The United States Geological Survey has not issued a warning. No evacuation order, no public alert. Scientists are watching this sequence carefully, but watching is different from warning. So what we have, as of this moment, is not a disaster. What we have is a question. The question is not whether this is dangerous that framing gets the stakes wrong and tends to make people either too frightened or too dismissive. The real question is a more precise and, in some ways, more unsettling one. What kind of earthquake sequence is this? Because there are different kinds. A swarm that releases stress and fades, a foreshock sequence that precedes something larger, a regional cascade where one fault system nudges another. These three possibilities look essentially identical in the early stages. You cannot tell them apart in real time by staring at a seismogram, and that ambiguity, that fundamental inability to know, with modern technology and modern data, which of those three categories this falls into, is the thing that makes this sequence worth your attention. The pattern here is the story, not the individual events. An isolated magnitude 5 earthquake in Nevada is unremarkable. A cluster of 4 events within one magnitude unit, spanning 17 days, in a zone that has been historically quiet for decades, that is a signal that pattern recognition systems, human and algorithmic alike, are designed to notice. Scientists are noticing it. And the last time a sequence that resembled this one unfolded in western Nevada, the ground did not quiet down on its own. It kept building, for months, and then it tore open. We will get to that part of the story. But first, we need to understand exactly where these earthquakes are happening, and why the geometry of this swarm is, all by itself, a second red flag hiding underneath the first one. Part high. The geometry of the swarm. You could be forgiven for thinking of an earthquake as a point A dot on a map, and X marks the spot where the ground let go. That is roughly how they appear on the news graphics. A circle, maybe color-coded by magnitude, placed over the general region, and you are left with the impression that earthquakes happen at locations the way car accidents happen at intersections. Discrete. Bounded. Localizable. The Silver Springs sequence does not behave like a point. When seismologists plot the 440 events on a map and then look at where they cluster, what emerges is not a cloud of random scatter. What emerges is a lineation and narrow, elongated distribution of earthquake hypocenters trending roughly northeast to southwest. That trend is not random, it is structural. It is the shape of a fault, or possibly several faults, expressing themselves through the pattern of how they break. The depth profile adds a second dimension to this picture. The events in this sequence are occurring predominantly between 5 and 10 kilometers beneath the surface. That depth range sits squarely within the brittle crust, the portion of the Earth where rock behaves like, well, rock, rigid, elastic, capable of storing stress and then releasing it suddenly. Below roughly 15 kilometers in this part of Nevada, the crust begins to behave more plastically, deforming slowly rather than snapping. But at 5 to 10 kilometers, you are in the zone where the ground locks up, loads up, and eventually breaks. And when it breaks at that depth, the seismic waves travel efficiently to the surface. The shaking is felt strongly. The energy does not dissipate before it arrives at the buildings, roads, and people above it. Now here is where the geometry gets interesting, and where the question of what kind of sequence this is becomes harder to answer. A typical aftershock sequence following a single main shock produces what seismologists call a decay cloud, a cluster of events that is densest near the main shock hypocenter and progressively sparser as you move outward in both space and time. The cluster decays, it shrinks, it dies back toward its center of origin. That is the spatial signature of stress being released and redistributed in the immediate vicinity of the rupture. The Silver Springs sequence is not doing that. The seismicity is not decaying toward a center. It is persisting across a corridor, a narrow but extended zone. that suggests multiple fault segments may be activating, not just one. When you have multiple fault segments in proximity, you open the door to a phenomenon called fault linkage, where rupture on one segment loads the tips of adjacent segments, increasing the stress on faults that were already near their breaking point. And fault linkage is one of the mechanisms through which relatively modest-seeming earthquake sequences can, under the right conditions, cascade into something substantially larger than any individual event in the sequence would suggest. This is not a prediction. Let me be very clear about that. The geometry of this swarm does not tell us that fault linkage is occurring or that a larger rupture is imminent. What it tells us is that the system involved is more complex than a single fault releasing its accumulated stress in a tidy and predictable fashion. Complexity in a fault system is not inherently dangerous. Many complex systems simply churn through minor events for months and then go quiet. But complexity does make the sequence harder to interpret, and harder to interpret means harder to anticipate what comes next. There is also the question of cascading versus simultaneous rupture. When multiple fault segments are active, they can fail one at a time in sequence, each rupture loading the next, or they can fail together in a way that produces a single large event whose apparent magnitude reflects the combined length of the rupture. The 1954 Fairview Peak earthquake in Nevada, which we will come back to in detail later, involved a double rupture on multiple segments within seconds. From the outside, it looked like one earthquake. From the inside of the fault system, it was a cascade. The ground did not care about the distinction. The shaking was the same either way. What the geometry of the Silver Springs swarm is telling us, not predicting, but telling us, is that the fault system currently active is not behaving like a single fault doing its single fault thing. It is behaving like a system. And that distinction between a fault and a fault system is the difference between a sequence that has a natural ceiling and one that does not have an obvious ceiling at all. The statistics of this swarm, which we need to look at separately, reinforce that interpretation in a way that is either reassuring or alarming, depending on how much you trust statistical ambiguity, which is to say, not much. Part Bar, the statistical red flag. Every earthquake sequence has a fingerprint, and the most important part of that fingerprint is something called the magnitude frequency distribution. The name sounds technical, but the concept is genuinely simple. If you take all the earthquakes in a sequence and count how many occur at each magnitude level, you get a pattern. Lots of small ones, fewer medium ones, very few large ones. This is almost universal across seismic systems worldwide. And the slope of the line that describes this pattern, the ratio between small and large events, is captured in a single number called the B value. The B value is, in a sense, the stress gauge of a fault system. In most seismic environments, the B value hovers around 1. That means for every magnitude 3 earthquake, you expect roughly 10 magnitude 2 earthquakes. For every magnitude 4, roughly 10 magnitude 3s. The ratio is consistent. It is one of the most reproducible empirical observations in geophysics. When the B value drops below 1, when there are proportionally fewer small earthquakes relative to large ones, that is interpreted tentatively and with appropriate caution as a sign of elevated stress within the system. The rock is not failing as readily at small scales. The small failures are being suppressed by a stress regime that is already primed for larger releases. Preliminary analysis of the Silver Springs sequence suggests a B value of around 1 or slightly below. This is not dramatically anomalous on its own, but combined with the magnitude spacing of the 4 largest events, it contributes to a picture that deserves attention. Return to those 4 events: 5.7, 5.2, 4.8, 4.7. Barth's law, as we established, predicts the largest aftershock should be about 1.2 magnitude units below the main shock. After a 5.7, that gives you an expected largest aftershock around 4.5. What the Silver Springs sequence has produced is a 5.2, which is not 1.2 units below the main shock. It is only 0.5 units below. And in terms of actual energy release, that difference matters enormously. Magnitude is a logarithmic scale. Each whole unit represents approximately 32 times more energy. So the observed largest aftershock in this sequence is releasing roughly 5 times more energy than the largest aftershock Barth's law predicts. The system is not dissipating its seismic energy in the pattern that physics tells us to expect. That excess seismic moment, the extra energy being released at the high end of the magnitude range, can be interpreted several ways. It might indicate that the initial magnitude 5.7 was not actually the main shock of the sequence, but was itself a foreshock to something not yet recorded. It might indicate that multiple fault segments ruptured simultaneously or in rapid sequence during the early events, producing a combined energy release that is being distributed across several labeled events. Or it might indicate that the sequence is a foreshock cluster, a statistically anomalous grouping of events that precedes a larger rupture rather than following one. The frustrating truth, and this is the thing that keeps seismologists up at night in a professional sense, is that all three of those interpretations are consistent with the same data. The statistical signature of a foreshock cluster and the statistical signature of a complex multifold aftershock sequence look almost identical in the early stages. You cannot use the B-value, the magnitude spacing, or the energy budget alone to determine which interpretation is correct. The data is real, and the anomaly is real, but the anomaly is ambiguous, and that ambiguity is precisely why scientists are watching this sequence rather than issuing warnings or dismissing it. The pattern demands attention. The pattern does not, by itself, demand a conclusion, and it is that inability to reach a conclusion in real time, while the sequence is still unfolding, that is the central problem this story keeps returning to. Part born, the second event, nobody is connecting enough. On April 29, 2026, approximately 36 hours before the May 1st magnitude 5.2 near Silver Springs, a magnitude 4.7 earthquake occurred near Pahranagat, Nevada. Pahranagat is not a name most people know. It is a small, sparsely populated area in Lincoln County, in the southern part of the state, roughly 500 kilometers from Silver Springs. 500 kilometers is not a short distance. For context, that is approximately the distance from Los Angeles to San Francisco or from New York City to Detroit. By any conventional seismological standard, two earthquakes 500 kilometers apart are not considered part of the same sequence unless there is a very specific and demonstrable connection between them. And yet, the two events share some characteristics that make casual dismissal feel slightly uncomfortable. They are both occurring within the broader structural framework of the Walker Lane Belt and its associated fault systems, a regional scale shear zone that runs through Nevada and connects, in various ways, to fault structures across a large portion of the western interior of North America. The timing, 36 hours of separation, is not the timing of a coincidence you can comfortably ignore, but it is also not the timing of a straightforward stress transfer event. Here is why the timing matters. There are two main mechanisms by which one earthquake can trigger another at a distance. The first is static stress transfer, the permanent redistribution of stress in the crust following a rupture. Static stress transfer is well documented at short distances, typically within a few fault lengths of the original rupture. At 500 kilometers, static stress, changes from a magnitude 5 event, are extremely small fractions of a bar and are generally considered too small to trigger earthquakes in a crust that is not already essentially at the failure threshold. The second mechanism is dynamic triggering, the transient shaking from seismic waves passing through a distant fault system and temporarily perturbing it enough to trigger failure. Dynamic triggering is real and documented, but it is almost always near instantaneous. The seismic waves pass through the distant fault, and if they are going to trigger something, they trigger it within minutes to hours. 36 hours is neither of those timescales. It is too far from the source for standard static stress transfer at that magnitude, and it is too delayed for classic dynamic triggering, which leaves a third, more speculative possibility that both events are responding to a broader, regional-scale stress adjustment in the plate boundary system of the western United States. This is not a fringe idea. There is a body of scientific literature exploring the concept of regional-scale stress reorganization, particularly within complex fault networks like the ones that exist in the Basin and Range province. But it is also not a consensus idea. There are serious researchers who would look at the Paranagat event and the Silver Springs sequence and conclude that the 500-kilometer separation and the 36-hour gap are both within the range of statistical coincidence for background seismicity in an active region. The honest answer is that there is no consensus. The events may be independent two separate faults doing two separate things in the same active region during the same 2-week window, or they may be expressing something about the current stress state of the regional fault network that we do not yet have the tools to fully interpret. What makes this uncertainty relevant to the Silver Springs sequence specifically is that if the events are connected, if they are both responding to the same regional stress adjustment, then the system in question is not a local fault near Reno. It is something much larger, and a much larger system, by definition, has the potential for much larger events. That is not a statement of probability, it is a statement of scale. The question of what kind of sequence this is, background swarm, foreshock sequence, regional cascade, becomes considerably more consequential if the boundaries of the system are measured in hundreds of kilometers rather than tens. Part num. The three doors. Imagine you are standing in a hallway in front of three identical doors. Behind one of them is nothing, an empty room, no consequence. You walk in and walk out and go home. Behind the second door is a larger earthquake, potentially magnitude 6 or greater, arriving at some point in the coming days or weeks, with no reliable way to predict exactly when. Behind the third door is something more diffuse but potentially more far-reaching, a regional scale adjustment in the fault systems of the western interior, a cascade that does not necessarily produce one catastrophic rupture but redistributes stress across a broader network in ways that increase seismic hazard at multiple locations over months or years. Now imagine that all three doors look exactly the same from where you are standing. The paint is the same color, the handles are identical. There is no keyhole through which to peer. This is, with reasonable accuracy, the situation that seismologists face when they look at the Silver Springs sequence right now. The first door is what scientists call a background swarm. Nevada has many of them. The 2008 Reno earthquake swarm is the closest direct comparison, more than 1,000 individual events over several months, significant enough to cause property damage and genuine public concern, ultimately resolving without a major rupture. The swarm ended not with a bang but with a gradual quiet, the system bleeding off accumulated stress through the collective release of hundreds of small events. If the Silver Springs sequence is behind door 1, then we are watching a fault system doing its normal, albeit noisy, housekeeping. The activity will continue for some period, decay gradually, and ultimately resolve. No single large rupture. No regional cascade. Just the ground doing what the ground in Nevada does. The second door is the foreshock scenario. Foreshock sequences are, in retrospect, among the most terrifying things in seismology, not because they are predictable, but because they are identifiable. After a major earthquake occurs, seismologists can often look back at the preceding weeks or months and identify a pattern of smaller events that, in hindsight, were clearly building toward the rupture. The 1975 Haicheng earthquake in China is the most famous case in which a foreshock-based prediction was actually issued and acted upon, saving an estimated 90,000 to 150,000 lives. But the 1976 Tangshan earthquake, which killed a number of people widely estimated between 240,000 and 700,000, was preceded by no recognized foreshock sequence at all, and dozens of sequences that looked like foreshocks resolved harmlessly. The second door is real, it exists, but standing in the hallway, you cannot see its hinges from the outside. If Silver Springs is a foreshock sequence, the time window for escalation is open. Foreshock sequences can precede main shocks by days, weeks, or in some documented cases, months. There is no universal clock. The magnitude 5.7 on April 14th could be the first event in a sequence building towards something in the magnitude 6 to 7 range. The Bath's law violation, the excess energy in the largest aftershocks, would be consistent with that interpretation. So would the persistence of the activity across a defined fault corridor without the expected decay. The third door is the regional cascade scenario. This is the most speculative of the three, but it is not without historical precedent in the very region we are discussing. The 1954 Nevada earthquake sequence involved two major ruptures, the Fairview Peak earthquake and the Dixie Valley earthquake, occurring within minutes of each other on separate fault segments. Some researchers have interpreted Nevada's mid-20th century seismicity as a regional cascade, a period in which major stress redistribution triggered large events across a wide geographic area over a span of decades. If the current Silver Springs sequence is the opening chapter of something like that, then the implications extend well beyond Lyon County. Here is the uncomfortable part. All three scenarios produce the same seismogram, the same 4 events, the same 440 total earthquakes, the same Bath's law violation. You cannot distinguish door 1 from door 2 from door 3 using only the data currently available. The sequence itself will eventually resolve the ambiguity either by fading, escalating, or spreading, but by the time the resolution arrives, the choice between doors will have already been made by the fault system itself. Seismology, for all of its sophistication, is in the peculiar position of being able to characterize the problem with extraordinary precision while being largely unable to solve it before the answer arrives. To understand why those are the only 3 meaningful options available, to why modern science has not devised a fourth door that says, we know for certain we need to go underground, not metaphorically. We need to talk about the architecture of the ground beneath Nevada, because what is happening at the surface is a direct expression of a system that was built over millions of years, and that science is still, in important ways, learning to read. Part Sao, the overlooked fault system. Most people who think about earthquake risk in the American West think about California. Specifically, they think about the San Andreas Fault, that long, elegant, geologically famous fracture in the Earth's crust that runs from the Gulf of California northward through the state, passing within walking distance of Los Angeles and San Francisco, carrying the accumulated seismic anxiety of a region that knows, on some level, that the ground beneath it is always negotiating with itself. The San Andreas is real, it is dangerous, and it deserves the attention it gets. But it is not the only place where tectonic plates are being reconciled in the American West, and focusing on it exclusively creates a blind spot large enough to swallow Nevada. The Walker Lane Belt is that blind spot. It is a distributed shear zone, not a single fault, but a collection of faults, hundreds of kilometers wide, running from the Gulf of California northward through eastern California and across Nevada into Oregon. It is geologically younger than the San Andreas, structurally more complex, and in terms of public awareness, essentially invisible. The Walker Lane accommodates somewhere between 20 and 25% of the total plate motion between the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate. Let that sit for a moment. 1/4 of the tectonic motion that the San Andreas is famous for is being absorbed by a system that most people have never heard of. The Walker Lane is what geologists call a transtensional system. It experiences both shear, the sideways sliding motion you associate with strike-slip faults like the San Andreas, and extension, the pulling apart motion you associate with the basin and range province that Nevada sits within. That combination produces a particular kind of structural complexity. Instead of one clean-through going fault, you get multiple fault strands, arranged in a right-stepping and echelon pattern, each accommodating a portion of the total motion. The faults connect, overlap, and interact in ways that make the system fundamentally harder to characterize than a single fault would be. Some geologists have proposed that the Walker Lane is not simply an existing tectonic structure, but an evolving one, that it represents the early stages of a new plate boundary, forming through the interior of the continent. The San Andreas may be aging out of its role as the primary plate boundary, and the Walker Lane may be the structure that eventually takes its place over the next several million years. This is a longer timescale than is relevant to anyone alive, but it tells you something important about the structural significance of the Walker Lane. It is not a secondary fault system. It is a primary tectonic feature that has simply been overshadowed by its more famous neighbour. The Silver Springs sequence is unfolding directly within the Walker Lane belt. When you look at the northeast to southwest trend of the swarm's lineation and compare it to the structural grain of the Walker Lane, the alignment is not coincidental. This sequence is not happening in spite of the regional structure, it is happening because of it. The fault system currently expressing itself near Silver Springs is a product of the same tectonic forces that have built the Walker Lane over millions of years, and it is operating within a network of interconnected faults that extends far beyond the boundaries of Lyon County. And that brings us to a question that some researchers have been asking, with increasing urgency: how interconnected exactly is this system? Because if the Walker Lane is as structurally continuous as some recent research suggests, then the implications for how we interpret individual sequences within it, like the one unfolding right now, change substantially. Part B: the Wernicke hypothesis. In the early 2000s, geophysicist Brian Wernicke and colleagues proposed something that, if correct, changes the way we should think about seismic risk in the entire western interior of North America. The hypothesis, which has been refined and debated in the years since, describes a corridor of interconnected fault systems running from the Walker Lane in Nevada through the eastern California shear zone into the Pahranagat shear zone and extending toward the Wasatch Fault at the eastern boundary of the Basin and Range Province. If this structural connection is real, then what Wernicke's work implies is something that the seismological community has not fully agreed on, but cannot entirely dismiss: that these fault systems may function, under certain circumstances, as a single stress conduit. Stress generated by tectonic loading in one part of the corridor could, in principle, be transmitted through the interconnected fault network and emerge as seismicity or rupture at a geographically distant location within the same corridor. The Walker Lane sequence near Silver Springs and the Pahranagat event on April 29th, which sits within the Pahranagat shear zone that Wernicke's model includes in its corridor, would be, under this hypothesis, not coincidental neighbours but expressions of the same regional stress system. Let me be precise about the scientific status of this idea. The Wernicke hypothesis is not fringe science. It is published in peer-reviewed literature and has been cited and engaged with by mainstream seismologists. But it is also not consensus. There are serious researchers who look at the same fault networks and conclude that the evidence for stress transmission across the full length of the proposed corridor is insufficient to override the simpler interpretation that these are independent fault systems that happen to be geographically proximate. The opposing view holds that the gaps and offsets in the fault network are large enough to prevent the kind of through-going stress transmission the hypothesis requires. What makes this debate relevant to the Silver Springs sequence is not that it resolves the question of what kind of sequence we are watching. It does not. What it does is expand the frame of the question. If the Walker Lane is operating in relative isolation as a local fault system, then the Silver Springs swarm is a Nevada problem significant for the region, but bounded. If something closer to the Wernicke hypothesis is correct, and the Walker Lane is part of a connected stress corridor that extends across several hundred kilometers of the western interior, then a prolonged and anomalous sequence within the Walker Lane is not just a Nevada problem, it is a regional problem. It is a question about the current stress state of a system that underlies portions of Nevada, California, and Utah. That is a much larger frame, and we are not in a position yet to confidently choose between the small frame and the large one. Part Term Stress Transfer Mechanics. The physics of how earthquakes influence each other is both well understood in principle and deeply frustrating in practice, which is a combination that comes up a lot in geophysics. The mechanism at the heart of the question is called Coulomb stress transfer, and the basic idea is intuitive once you see it. When a fault ruptures, it does not simply release stress at its own location and leave everything else unchanged. It redistributes stress. Some areas of the surrounding crust experience a reduction in stress, what geologists call a stress shadow, while other areas experience an increase. Faults that are already close to failure, sitting near their breaking point, can be tipped into rupture by a Coulomb stress increase that is, in absolute terms, very small. We are talking about fractions of a bar comparable to the weight of a few meters of rock added to the surface above a fault. This mechanism is real and documented. It is one of the primary explanations for why aftershock zones have the geographic shape they do, why aftershocks cluster in particular regions, rather than being randomly distributed around the main shock. The stress redistribution is not random. It has a geometry governed by the orientation of the fault that ruptured and the regional stress field it is embedded in. Researchers routinely calculate Coulomb stress changes following major earthquakes and use them to identify which nearby faults have been loaded and which have been unloaded. The limitation is scale. Static stress transfer, the permanent redistribution of stress in the crust, falls off rapidly with distance from the source rupture. For a magnitude 5 earthquake, significant stress changes are generally confined to within a few tens of kilometers of the fault. At 500 kilometers, the static stress change from a magnitude 5 event is negligibly small. This is why the potential connection between the Silver Springs sequence and the April 29th Paranagat event remains in the category of hypothesis rather than established fact. The physics of static stress transfer does not comfortably bridge that distance at that magnitude. Dynamic stress transfer, the transient perturbation caused by seismic waves passing through a distant fault system, is a different story. Dynamic triggering is well documented at distances of hundreds to even thousands of kilometers. The mechanism works differently. It does not permanently load a distant fault, but it temporarily reduces the effective normal stress as the seismic waves pass through, potentially allowing a fault that was already at or near failure to slip. This is real. It has been observed, but, and this is the critical point, dynamic triggering is almost always immediate. The seismic waves arrive, they perturb the fault, and if triggering is going to occur, it occurs within minutes to hours. A 36-hour delay does not fit the dynamic triggering signature, and so we return to the ambiguity at the core of the Silver Springs sequence. The physics of stress transfer is well understood. The mechanisms are documented, the math can be done, but the current sequence sits in a gap between what the physics comfortably explains and what it definitively rules out, which means that interpreting what the data is telling us about where the system is headed remains, for now, an open question. Part Cheen, the energy budget problem. The magnitude 5.2 earthquake near Silver Springs released approximately 10 to the 14th power joules of energy. Written out, that is 100 trillion joules. That is a genuinely large number by human standards. It is roughly equivalent to the energy released by a small nuclear warhead detonated underground, though the comparison requires a great many caveats about how energy is measured and how it propagates in different media. This comparison tends to invite a particular class of questions that surface every time there is an unusual earthquake sequence. Did something cause this? Did nuclear testing, or underground facilities, or high-powered electromagnetic systems tip the fault into failure? The energy budget provides the clearest answer to that question: no. And here is why. The energy required to trigger an earthquake is not the same as the energy released by the earthquake. A massive reservoir of water added to a fault system can trigger earthquakes not because the water weighs enough to crack the rock, but because water pressure reduces the effective friction on fault surfaces, allowing them to slip with far less applied force. Triggering is about perturbing a system that is already loaded. It is about the last straw, not the entire haystack. A very small energy input can, in principle, trigger a much larger energy release, the way a spark does not need to contain the energy of the wildfire it starts. This means that the energy mismatch argument, the observation that no human-made energy source is powerful enough to have caused a magnitude 5.2 earthquake, does not actually rule out the possibility of triggering. It rules out direct causation by an external energy source. Triggering is a different mechanism, but what it does not answer is whether any known human activity is currently exerting a perturbation on the Silver Springs fault system sufficient to have triggered this sequence. The honest answer, based on available evidence, is that there is no evidence of any such mechanism operating here. The Silver Springs sequence is consistent with entirely natural tectonic behavior within the Walker Lane belt. The interesting mystery is not who or what caused it. The interesting mystery is what it means for what comes next. Part Mui, the real unknown. There is a concept in mechanics called a metastable system. A ball balanced on the tip of a needle is in metastable equilibrium, technically balanced, but extraordinarily sensitive to perturbation. A fault system loaded with tectonic stresses, in a meaningful sense, always in a state of metastable equilibrium. The crust is being stressed continuously by the slow, grinding motion of tectonic plates. Faults accumulate strain at rates of millimeters to centimeters per year. Over decades and centuries, that accumulated strain builds up to the point where the fault is, in principle, ready to fail loaded, like a spring compressed to its maximum extent. What prevents it from failing is friction. The fault surfaces are rough, they are in contact under enormous pressure, and overcoming that friction requires not just the accumulated stress, but the right geometry of applied force. The critical problem, the thing that makes earthquake prediction genuinely difficult, rather than just technically difficult, is that we have no reliable way to measure the stress state of a fault in real time. We cannot drill deep enough into active fault zones to instrument them adequately. We can measure surface deformation with GPS and satellite geodesy, and that tells us something about strain accumulation at the surface, but the relationship between surface strain and fault stress at depth is complicated by the geometry of the crust and the variability of rock properties. We are, in a meaningful sense, working blind. We can describe the history of a fault. We can estimate its long-term slip rate. We can calculate the time elapsed since its last major rupture. But we cannot tell you whether the fault beneath Silver Springs is at 30% of its failure threshold or 90%, or whether it already crossed the failure threshold 3 days ago and is simply waiting for the right triggering perturbation. This is the real unknown at the center of the Silver Springs story. Not who is watching, not what the seismograms show, not what Bath's law predicts. The real unknown is whether the fault system currently expressing itself in Lyon County, Nevada, is in the early stages of a routine stress release, or whether it is a spring that has been compressed for 70 years since the last major Nevada rupture in 1954, and is now beginning to express that accumulated energy in a form that has not yet shown us its ceiling. We have seen this situation before, not in a theoretical sense, not in an abstract, historical precedent sense, in a viscerally specific, geographically proximate, pattern-matching sense that seismologists looking at the Silver Springs data in May of 2026 have explicitly noted, because in 1932, in essentially the same region, a sequence of earthquakes began that looked statistically, geometrically, and behaviorally a great deal like this one, and it did not stop. Part Muemot, the build-up, nobody took seriously. The summer and fall of 1932 were not quiet in central Nevada. They were not dramatic either, not in any way that would have attracted widespread attention. There were no television cameras, no social media swarms, no real-time seismogram feeds being watched by concerned residents on their phones at 1 a.m. There were seismographs, the technology existed, but they were sparse, and the instruments of the era captured enough information to confirm that earthquakes were occurring while leaving considerable uncertainty about their precise magnitudes and locations. researchers reconstructing this period today, using modern computational methods applied to the original seismographic records, have been able to piece together a picture that is considerably more detailed than what was available to the scientists of the time. And what that picture shows is a build-up that, viewed in retrospect, follows a pattern that will seem familiar. Throughout the summer and into the autumn of 1932, a series of moderate earthquakes rattled the high desert of central Nevada. Magnitude 5, magnitude 6 events, large enough to be felt across a wide area, to knock items from shelves, to generate brief alarm among the sparse rural population of that part of the state. And then, critically, they did not stop. The expected decay did not materialize. The events continued, persisted in a geographic zone that covered broadly the same region that would later become associated with the Cedar Mountain fault system. The clustering was tight. The magnitudes were not dropping in the way that aftershock sequences are supposed to drop. The pattern, if anyone had been looking at it with the statistical tools and conceptual frameworks that exist today, would have resembled a system that was organizing itself rather than dissipating. But nobody was looking at it that way in 1932. The conceptual tools for recognizing a foreshock sequence in real time did not exist. The seismological community of the era did not have Barth's law. The B-value analysis did not exist in its modern form. Coulomb stress transfer was decades away from formulation. What the scientists of 1932 had was a collection of seismographic records, a map of felt reports, and a set of empirical intuitions that had not yet been systematized into the kind of pattern recognition framework that modern seismology uses. So the build-up in the summer and fall of 1932 was logged, it was noted, and it was not understood for what it was. There were eyewitness accounts from ranchers and small-town residents across central Nevada describing persistent ground trembling, strange sounds from the earth, unsettled livestock. These are the kinds of reports that populate the historical literature of pre-major earthquake sequences worldwide, and they are the kinds of reports that are easy to dismiss in real time and easy to overweight in retrospect. Seismologists are appropriately cautious about using anecdotal accounts of animal behavior or ground sounds as seismic indicators, but the seismographic record, reconstructed with modern techniques, tells a story that does not require anecdotal embellishment. For months before December of 1932, the fault system in central Nevada was active in a way that was not routine. The problem was that nobody could tell routine from non-routine in real time, which is, precisely, the problem that seismologists watching the Silver Springs sequence in May of 2026 are confronting today. Not with less technology, not with less data, with more of both, and still facing the same fundamental limitation. Part Muihai, December 21st, 1932. At approximately 6:21 p.m. local time on December 21st, 1932, the ground in central Nevada tore open. The Cedar Mountain earthquake, named for a sparsely populated mountain range in Mineral County, Nevada, has been assigned a magnitude of approximately 7.1 in modern reanalysis, though estimates have ranged somewhat depending on the methodology used. What is not in dispute is the surface expression of the rupture. The earthquake produced approximately 75 kilometers of surface rupture visible fault scarps, ground cracks, offsets in the terrain that were measurable and mappable in the days and weeks that followed. 75 kilometers of surface rupture is not a small event. It is a rupture that, if it occurred along an urban fault in the modern era, would be catastrophic in its consequences. In 1932, Mineral County, Nevada, was not an urban environment. The population was sparse. The infrastructure was limited. The damage, while real, was not the kind of mass casualty event that a similar rupture would produce today in a more developed region. Some structures were damaged or destroyed. The event was felt across an enormous area. Reports came from California, Utah, and Oregon. But in human terms, the immediate impact was relatively contained by the accident of geography. The rupture happened in one of the least densely populated parts of the continental United States. The ground deformation was complex. The rupture did not follow a single clean fault line, but showed the kind of multi-strand complexity that is consistent with a system involving multiple fault segments, some rupturing sequentially, some nearly simultaneously. The geometry of the surface expression suggested that the Cedar Mountain earthquake was not a simple event, but a complex one, with energy being released across a zone rather than along a single line. This complexity, viewed alongside the months of precursory activity, raises a question that modern seismologists have returned to multiple times. Was the Cedar Mountain earthquake the main shock of the sequence, or was it the largest event in a longer, more complex cascade? Think about what that question implies for the Silver Springs sequence, where 4 events within 1 magnitude unit have occurred in 17 days, and where the fault system is showing the spatial complexity of a multi-segment structure. The Cedar Mountain earthquake looked, in its precursory phase, like a sequence that was organizing itself, and then it released. Not at the scale that the early activity might have suggested, but at a scale considerably larger than the preceding months of Num and Mars activity alone would have indicated as the upper bound. The question of whether that could happen again in the same general region, under conditions that look similar in important ways, is not rhetorical. It is the operational question that researchers watching the current sequence are trying to answer before the fault system answers it for them. Part Muibar, it wasn't an isolated event. The 1932 Cedar Mountain earthquake would be a significant enough historical data point on its own, but Nevada's seismic history does not allow us to treat it as an isolated incident, and that is where the story gets considerably larger in scope. In 1915, 17 years before Cedar Mountain, the Pleasant Valley earthquake struck northwestern Nevada with a magnitude of 7.2. It produced one of the longest and most well-documented surface ruptures in Nevada history, approximately 60 kilometers of fault scarps, some of which are still visible in the landscape today. More than a century later, Pleasant Valley in 1915, Cedar Mountain in 1932, and then, 22 years after that, the events that complete the trilogy. On December 16, 1954, the Fairview Peak earthquake struck with a magnitude of approximately 7.2. Within minutes, some accounts say within seconds, a second major earthquake, the Dixie Valley earthquake, struck a separate fault system approximately 50 kilometers away with a magnitude of approximately 6.8, a double rupture, 2 separate faults failing in the same moment, or within such a short interval that the seismograms of the era could barely separate them. This is what a regional cascade looks like when it completes. Not one earthquake, not even 2 sequential earthquakes, 2 nearly simultaneous ruptures on separate fault systems, releasing energy across a combined surface rupture that extended well over 100 kilometers. Consider the temporal span of these events. Pleasant Valley in 1915, Cedar Mountain in 1932, Fairview Peak and Dixie Valley in 1954. 39 years from the first to the last. 3 major earthquakes, 4, if you count the Dixie Valley event, separately in the same regional fault system, in the same distributed zone of the Walker Lane Belt. This is what geologists call temporal clustering of large earthquakes, and it is one of the most statistically striking features of Nevada's modern seismic record. Globally, the temporal clustering of large earthquakes is recognized as real but not well understood. Fault systems that appear quiet for long periods can suddenly produce multiple large events in a compressed time window, as if the system has passed some internal threshold and is now releasing energy across its full network rather than at isolated points. The significance of this clustering for the current moment is not subtle. The last major earthquake in the Nevada sequence, the Dixie Valley event of December 1954, occurred 72 years ago. The long-term historical record of the Walker Lane Belt, thin as it is, suggests recurrence intervals on individual faults that range from hundreds to thousands of years. But the temporal clustering of major events in 1915 through 1954 suggests that when the system enters an active phase, It produces multiple large events over decades, rather than distributing them uniformly across the recurrence interval. If that pattern has any predictive value, and we should be cautious about assuming it does, then a 72-year quiet period following the last cluster may not be a sign that the system is exhausted. It may be a sign that the system has been reloading. That word reloading carries implications that the Silver Springs sequence makes suddenly relevant. Part 11. The 70-year silence. There has not been a magnitude 7 or larger earthquake in Nevada since the Dixie Valley event of December 1954, not in 72 years. That is the longest gap in the modern seismic record for a region that produced 3 or 4 magnitude 7+ events in the preceding 4 decades. And the question of what that silence means, whether it represents a system that has relaxed and is now stable, or a system that has been accumulating stress for 7 decades, is genuinely unanswered. The concept of seismic quiescence is complicated. When a fault system goes quiet, there are at least 2 very different explanations available, and distinguishing between them is difficult. The first explanation is that the system has genuinely relaxed, that the major events of 1915 through 1954 released enough accumulated stress to reset the clock, and that the fault system is now in an early phase of its loading cycle, with centuries of strain accumulation required before the next major event. The second explanation is that the silence is superficial, that strain is continuing to accumulate at depth, that the fault system is not expressing that strain through small and moderate earthquakes the way it was in the active period, and that the quiet surface is masking ongoing deep loading that will eventually find expression in another cluster of large events. The historical record in Nevada is not long enough to definitively favor one explanation over the other. The written seismic record extends back only to the mid-19th century, a geological eye blink. Paleoseismic studies, which attempt to reconstruct earthquake history through the geology of fault scarps and disrupted sediments, can extend the record back thousands of years, but the resolution is coarse and the uncertainties are large. What we can say with confidence is that the Walker Lane Belt has been capable of producing multiple magnitude 7+ events over short time windows in the recent past, and that we are currently at a point in time where the last such window closed 72 years ago. What we cannot say with confidence is whether the Silver Springs sequence of 2026 is seismically significant in the context of that 72-year gap, or whether it is simply the kind of moderate swarm activity that has always characterized the Walker Lane and always will. The ambiguity is real. The uncertainty is not a failure of science. It is the honest state of knowledge about a system that is more complex than our current tools can fully resolve. But that ambiguity becomes considerably harder to sit with when you know that a sequence very similar in character to the current one preceded the largest earthquake in Nevada's modern history. Part 11. The Pattern Recognition Trap. Human beings are extraordinarily good at recognizing patterns. This is one of our most powerful cognitive tools and, simultaneously, one of our most dangerous. The brain does not wait for statistical certainty before detecting a pattern. It generates pattern hypotheses constantly at low computational cost, updating them as new information arrives. That process is efficient. It is adaptive. It is, in fact, the thing that allowed early humans to survive long enough to eventually invent seismographs. But in the context of earthquake prediction, this same cognitive gift becomes a profound liability, because the ground does not care what story your brain has assembled from the data. It has its own. Let's talk about what's actually in front of us right now. The pattern resemblance between the Mokngin Chincham Bamui Hai precursory sequence and the Hai Ngin Le Hai Mui Sao Silver Springs sequence is real. I want to be careful here, because this is a channel where I try to be straight with you, and it would be easy to oversell this. So let me be precise. The resemblance is not an artifact of selective attention. It is not cherry-picking. Researchers who study these sequences independently, without any agenda, without any YouTube script to write, arrive at the same observations the magnitude clustering, the persistence of activity past the point where it should have started decaying, the spatial coherence of the swarm along a defined fault corridor, the violation of Barth's law at the high end of the magnitude range. These are genuine data points. They are real features of a real seismic sequence that genuinely does not look like a routine aftershock series. This is not pareidolia. This is not a face in the clouds. The question, the honest, uncomfortable question, is what to make of them. And here is where science demands more than pattern recognition is able to give. Science requires statistical validation. It requires a demonstration that the resemblance between two sequences reflects an underlying physical similarity, not just the human brain's relentless drive to connect dots into meaningful shapes. And when you run that statistical test against the full historical record of earthquake sequences, not just the dramatic ones that preceded major ruptures, but all of them, including the thousands that looked alarming and then resolved quietly, the result is humbling. For every sequence that resembled a foreshock pattern and then preceded a major earthquake, there are multiple sequences that resembled the exact same foreshock pattern and resolved without one. The base rate of foreshock-like sequences that actually escalate to a main shock is low. Studies of global earthquake catalogues put the fraction of major earthquakes preceded by identifiable foreshock sequences somewhere between 10 and 40%, depending on the magnitude threshold and region, which means that between 60 and 90% of major earthquakes arrive without any such warning at all, and of the sequences that look like foreshocks in real time, that have the clustering, the persistence, the statistical anomalies, the vast majority do not escalate. Most sequences that look like foreshocks in real time are not foreshocks. This is not a failure of the scientists watching the Silver Springs data. It is not a failure of the monitoring systems. It is a true fact about the distribution of earthquake sequences in nature. The fault system does not organize its behavior to accommodate our need for clear categories. It produces sequences that are ambiguous by default, and the ambiguity is not resolvable from the outside in real time with the tools currently available. That is the actual state of affairs. But, and this is the part that makes dismissal equally difficult, the sequences that do precede major earthquakes are, in most cases, indistinguishable from the sequences that do not. Until the major earthquake either occurs or definitively fails to occur, the two categories look identical. Retrospective clarity is not the same as prospective knowledge. These are not interchangeable, and that asymmetry is everything. Think about what that means for Ngin Chintram Bamuihai, the build-up to the Cedar Mountain earthquake, the months of magnitude 5s and 6s clustering across central Nevada without the expected decay looked, in real time, like elevated but not extraordinary seismicity. Scientists of the era logged it. They noted it. They did not raise alarms, partly because the conceptual tools for recognizing a foreshock sequence in real time did not yet exist, and partly because elevated seismicity in Nevada is the background condition. It is the baseline. Elevated from what, exactly? And then December Haimu Mortst arrived. And after that, after the ground tore open along Baimurlum kilometers of fault line on the winter solstice, the preceding months of activity looked like a textbook foreshock sequence. Suddenly obvious, suddenly unmistakable. Scientists looking backward at the data could trace the narrative clearly. Here is where the stress was accumulating. Here is where the fault system was organizing itself. Here is the sequence building toward the rupture. But the data did not change between before and after. Not a single seismogram was altered. What changed was the frame. And the frame changed for one reason only. The rupture arrived and told everyone which category the sequence belonged to. The fault system, indifferent to the scientists watching it, resolved the ambiguity in its own way, on its own schedule, without any input from the seismograms at all. That is the pattern recognition trap, and I want you to understand it precisely, because it is the central problem of this entire story, not just for Ngin Chintram Bamuihai, and not just for Silver Springs in Haingin Lair Haimuisao. The trap is not that the pattern is imaginary. It isn't. The trap is that seeing the pattern does not tell you what the pattern means. The pattern itself is genuinely there, The resemblance is real. The statistical anomalies in the Silver Springs sequence are real and documented, and being taken seriously by researchers who have no interest in sensationalism. And yet none of the data, none of the historical parallel, none of the Bath's law violation, or the spatial coherence, or the persistence, none of it resolves into a definitive answer about what happens next, because the fault system does not consult the seismograms before it makes its decision. I find that sentence almost philosophically unsettling, and I've been thinking about it for days. We have built instruments sensitive enough to detect the ground moving by a fraction of a millimeter. We have GPS networks measuring surface deformation across the entire width of Nevada in near real time. We have decades of carefully maintained seismic catalogs, sophisticated signal processing, and researchers who have dedicated their careers to understanding exactly this kind of sequence. And the fault, that ancient fracture in the rock 5 to 10 kilometers beneath the Nevada high desert, simply does not know any of that is happening. It knows only stress and friction. It knows only whether the accumulated force pushing its two sides past each other has exceeded the resistance holding them in place. When it has, it slips. When it hasn't, it doesn't. The seismograms are a one-way window. The fault does not look back through it. So, the question you've probably been sitting with since we started: how would anyone actually know in time? That question has been waiting since the beginning of this video, and I want to give you the honest answer, not the reassuring one. There is a partial answer. Modern seismology is not helpless here. There are specific signals that, if observed, shift the probability distribution between the three scenarios we've laid out. An upward creep in maximum magnitude, an expanding spatial footprint of the swarm, a deviation from the expected mathematical decay rate of aftershock sequences, what seismologists call the Omori-Utsu relation. Any of these, observed in the Silver Springs data in the coming days or weeks, would be meaningful. They would not be conclusive, but they would be meaningful. The monitoring systems watching this sequence, the USGS, the Nevada Seismological Laboratory, regional university research groups, are looking for exactly these signals in real time. And the tools available to them today are genuinely more powerful than what existed in Mtngin Chintram Bamihai. The network is denser, the algorithms are faster. The conceptual framework for interpreting anomalous sequences is vastly more developed than it was 90 years ago. And here is where I have to be straight with you again, because this channel does not exist to tell you what you want to hear. More powerful is not the same as sufficient. The lag between signal and interpretation is shorter than it has ever been, but shorter is not the same as zero. And in earthquake science, the gap between we are seeing something develop and we know what it means can close very slowly, or not at all, until the fault system forces the issue. The history of this specific region, the Walker Lane Belt, the same fault network that produced Cedar Mountain in Mtngin Chintram Bamihai and Fairview Peak in Mtngin Chintram Nammui, Bourne tells us that this system is capable of major rupture. The 72-year silence since the last major Nevada earthquake tells us either that the system has been reloading quietly or that it has genuinely relaxed. We cannot currently tell which, and the Silver Springs sequence, for all its statistical anomalies and all its historical echoes, has not yet told us which door we are standing behind. It is still choosing. The sequence will resolve this ambiguity eventually. All sequences do. The question is only whether the resolution arrives quietly, activity fading, another benign Nevada swarm archived and forgotten, or whether it arrives the way the last ambiguous Nevada sequence resolved on the winter solstice, with 75 kilometers of fault line deciding the argument for everyone. We are waiting on the fault, as always, as ever. And the waiting is the part that nobody in this field will tell you gets easier. Part Mui Sao, foreshocks are invisible in real time. A foreshock is one of the most precise and, simultaneously, most useless concepts in all of seismology, and I mean that genuinely. This is not me being dramatic for the camera. The definition is exact. A foreshock is an earthquake that precedes the main shock, occurs in the same general region as the main shock, and is smaller than the main shock. Clean, rigorous, unambiguous. The problem is that the definition only works in one direction. It only works backward. In real time right now, today, as the sensors in Lyon County, Nevada log another event in the Silver Springs sequence, every earthquake is simultaneously a potential main shock, a potential foreshock, and a potential aftershock. You cannot know which category it falls into until the sequence around it has fully developed, until the story ends. And you are never at the ending. You are always in the middle. The genre of the story tragedy, anticlimax, thriller is not printed on the cover. It is only revealed in the final chapter. And in seismology, the final chapter is written by the fault, not by the scientists watching it. This is not a small problem. This is the central problem. Everything else in this video, the Bath's law violation, the spatial footprint of the swarm, the 72-year silence since the last major Nevada rupture, the historical echo of Mokngin Chincham Bamui Hai, all of it feeds into this single, maddening limitation. We can describe the sequence in extraordinary detail. We cannot tell you what it is until it finishes telling us. But the history of earthquake prediction is not a story of pure helplessness. It has moments of genuine triumph and moments of catastrophic failure, and both of them are instructive in ways that matter directly for understanding what is unfolding in Nevada right now. Let me take you to northeastern China. February 4th, Mokngin Chincham Bay Mulam. The Haicheng earthquake is, depending on how you look at it, either the greatest success story in the history of earthquake science or a cautionary tale about how often success stories repeat themselves. What happened was this. Chinese seismologists, monitoring an active swarm in Liaoning province, observed patterns in the data that were consistent with a major rupture in preparation. The magnitude of the preceding events, their clustering, the rate at which they were occurring, and the way that rate was changing over time. It was enough, barely enough, but enough for officials to issue a formal public warning on February 4th. Hundreds of thousands of people were told to leave their homes. Many of them did. Hours later, a magnitude Baifei Bamui earthquake struck. It collapsed the buildings those people had been evacuated from. The casualty estimates vary, and the historical record is complicated by the political context of Mokngin Chincham Baimui's China, but the consensus is that the Haicheng prediction saved tens of thousands of lives, possibly more. It remains, to this day, the only instance in recorded history of a major earthquake prediction that was formally issued, publicly acted upon, and then validated by the subsequent event. One time, in all of recorded seismological history, one. Now hold that number in your head, one, and let me take you forward 14 months. July 28th, 1976, still China, the Tangshan earthquake, magnitude 7.80. It struck in the early hours of the morning, when nearly the entire population of a heavily industrialized city was asleep in buildings that had not been designed to survive what was about to happen. The death toll is disputed, it always is, in events of this scale, in that era but common estimates range from Hai Trum, Born Mui, Hung Tonam Trum, Hung people, one of the deadliest earthquakes of the 20th century, by any accounting. There had been no foreshock sequence recognized in real time, no warning issued, no evacuation ordered. The earthquake arrived without the precursory signature that had made Haicheng 14 months earlier at least partially predictable, and that silenced the absence of the signal that had saved lives in Liaoning became one of the most haunting data points in the history of the field. Tangshan was not a failure of monitoring. It was not a failure of the scientists. It was proof, written in catastrophic terms, that the foreshock sequence that made Haicheng predictable was the exception, not the rule. In a system where, as I keep coming back to, the rules are written by geology rather than by human convenience. The scientific literature on foreshock prediction, read in aggregate, delivers a message that is genuinely sobering. Studies of large earthquake catalogues, compiled from decades of seismic records across multiple continents and tectonic environments, consistently show that only a minority of major earthquakes are preceded by identifiable foreshock sequences. The range in those estimates is wide because it depends on magnitude thresholds and regional differences, and how strictly you define identifiable. But the numbers commonly cited fall between 10 and 40%, meaning that somewhere between 60 and 90% of major earthquakes, the big ones, the ones that reshape cities and dominate headlines, arrive with no foreshock sequence that seismologists can identify in the data beforehand. And then there is the other side of that coin, which is equally important and gets talked about less. Of the sequences that resemble foreshock patterns in real time, the swarms with anomalous statistics, the clusters that persist past expected decay, the sequences that make researchers sit up straight and start watching more carefully, the majority do not escalate to a major main shock. They resolve. The activity fades. The fault bleeds off its accumulated stress through many small events instead of one large one, and weeks or months later, the sequence gets filed away as a notable but ultimately benign swarm. This happens far more often than the escalation scenario. The base rate of foreshock-like sequences that actually precede major earthquakes is low. What I just described is called the false positive problem, and it is genuinely difficult to sit with because it means that responsible scientific communication about a sequence like Silver Springs is navigating between two failure modes simultaneously. Overstate the danger, and you contribute to the calibration problem. You train the public and decision makers to treat seismic warnings as noise, which makes it harder to mobilize appropriate responses on the occasions when the warning is real. Understate it, and you fail the people who deserve to understand what is actually in the data. This is not a counsel of despair. I want to be clear about that, because it's the kind of material that can slide easily into fatalism, and fatalism is not what the science supports. What the science supports is a precise description of what is known and what is not, and what is currently known about the Silver Springs sequence is this. It has characteristics consistent with a foreshock interpretation. It also has characteristics consistent with a complex aftershock sequence following the April 10 magnitude Numfei Bay Mui. And it has characteristics consistent with a background swarm of the kind that Nevada produces regularly, and that, in most cases, resolve without major rupture. All three interpretations are alive. None of them has been eliminated by the data currently available. The monitoring systems watching this sequence, the USGS, the Nevada Seismological Laboratory, university research groups across the region, are tracking it with exactly this ambiguity in mind. And I want to give credit where it is due, because the quality of real-time seismic monitoring in the United States in Hainan Layer, Haimusar, is genuinely remarkable compared to what existed even 20 years ago. The network density is higher, the processing algorithms are faster, the communication infrastructure between monitoring agencies and the public is more developed. None of this is nothing. The scientific community watching the Silver Springs data is not operating in the dark. They have real tools, real data, and real expertise pointed at this sequence in real time. The only question that actually matters here is not whether they are watching carefully enough. They are. The question is whether watching carefully enough is sufficient to know, in time to act, what the sequence is becoming. And if you ask any seismologist working on this directly, not for a press release, not for a public statement, but plainly and honestly, the way researchers talk to each other in hallways rather than in front of cameras, the answer you get is the most honest and most uncomfortable answer available. Sometimes, not always, not reliably, not with the kind of confidence that would allow a public official to issue an evacuation order for a major urban area based on seismic data alone, without facing the very real possibility that the sequence resolves harmlessly and the warning becomes the story instead of the earthquake. Not with the kind of certainty that Barth's law or Omuriutsu decay analysis or Coulomb stress modeling can deliver on demand. Sometimes the signals appear in time. Sometimes the escalation is visible in the data before the rupture arrives. Haicheng happened. It is a real data point. But Tangshan also happened. And it happened 14 months later, in the same country, with the same monitoring technology, watched by the same scientific community that had just pulled off the only successful major earthquake prediction in recorded history. The ground did not send a warning the second time, it simply arrived. That word "sometimes" is doing the most important work in this entire story, because sometimes is the gap between everything modern seismology can do and the one thing it has not yet learned to do reliably. It is the gap between the seismogram and the fault, and in that gap, in May of Hainginlea Haimuisao, 440 earthquakes are still unfolding in western Nevada in a pattern that has no definitive interpretation yet, watched by people who are doing everything right and still cannot tell you with certainty what comes next. The sequence is still being written. Part Muibai, the 3 outcomes revisited. We have been living with 3 doors since the beginning of this video. 3 identical doors in a hallway, same paint, same handle, no keyhole. And I told you at the start that modern seismology cannot reliably tell you which one leads where, not in real time, not while the sequence is still unfolding, not with the data currently available. We have covered a lot of ground since then. We have been underground, through the architecture of the Walker Lane Belt and its distributed network of faults that accommodates a quarter of all North American plate motion without ever making the front pages. We have stood in central Nevada in Mokngin Chin Tram Ba Mai Hai and watched a sequence that looked, at the time, like elevated background noise until the winter solstice arrived and the ground decided otherwise. We have done the math on Barth's law violations and B-values and Coulomb's stress transfer and the 72-year silence that followed the last major Nevada rupture in Mokngin Chin Tram Nammiborn. We have sat with the honest, uncomfortable answer that the scientists watching this sequence will give you if you ask them plainly. Sometimes they know in time, and sometimes they don't. Now, it is time to look at the 3 doors again, not with fresh eyes, with informed ones, because the question of what is behind each door is not abstract anymore. It has geography, it has history, it has numbers attached to it, and it deserves to be examined clearly, without either minimizing what the data shows or inflating it into something the data does not actually support. Door 1, the background swarm. Door 1 is statistically the most likely individual outcome. I want to say that plainly, because this is a channel that tries to be honest with you, even when honesty is less cinematically satisfying than alarm. Most anomalous swarms resolve without major rupture. That is not spin. That is the historical record. The closest direct comparison to the Silver Springs sequence is not Mokngin Chin Tram Ba Mai Hai. It is Hainginlea Tam. The Reno earthquake swarm of Hainginlea Tam involved more than 1,000 individual events over several months. It produced genuine public anxiety. It generated real property damage, cracked foundations, broken pipes, the low-level infrastructure disruption that a sustained swarm inflicts on a region, even when no single event is large enough to dominate the news cycle. People in Reno spent months waiting for the other shoe to drop. And then, gradually, it didn't. The activity decayed. The sequence was archived. The region returned to its baseline of background seismicity, and the Reno swarm became a data point in the scientific literature rather than the opening chapter of a disaster. The Walker Lane Belt generates elevated seismicity regularly. This is simply what it does. It is a tectonically active shear zone, accommodating the slow grind of plates against each other, and that accommodation process is not clean or quiet. It produces swarms. It produces clusters of moderate events that persist longer than textbook aftershock sequences predict they should. It produces sequences that, when you examine them statistically, look slightly anomalous and then resolve anyway, because slightly anomalous is the Walker Lane's baseline condition. If the Silver Springs sequence is behind door 1, here is what happens. In a few weeks or a few months, the activity rate begins to drop. The magnitude of the largest events stabilizes and then starts trending downward. The spatial footprint of the swarm stops expanding. The sequence decays in the way that background swarms decay, not dramatically, not with a clear endpoint, but with a gradual quieting that eventually crosses the threshold where researchers stop writing daily updates and start writing retrospective analyses. The sequence gets filed, the region returns to normal, the fault system will have spoken, and what it said will have been, Not this time. The direct consequences of this outcome are minimal. No major rupture, no mass casualty event, no infrastructure collapse. But I want to name an indirect consequence that does not get discussed enough because it matters for the long game. If the Silver Springs sequence decays harmlessly and again, this is the statistically most probable individual outcome. The public attention it generated will be logged. Mentally logged, institutionally logged, politically logged. Another earthquake scare that didn't pan out. Another instance of scientists and science communicators raising concern about a seismic sequence and being, in the end, wrong about the outcome. And that logging, repeated often enough across enough sequences in enough regions, produces a calibration problem that is genuinely dangerous. The public becomes desensitized. Decision makers become skeptical of seismic warnings as a category. The next time a monitoring agency flags an anomalous sequence, even one that turns out to be the real thing, the response is slower, the urgency is lower, the window for meaningful action is narrower. The Boy Who Cried Wolf is a fable about communication failure. In seismology, communication failure has a body count. Door 2, the foreshock scenario. Door 2 is the scenario that keeps seismologists professionally awake, not because it is the most likely outcome it isn't, but because it is the outcome where the gap between what we know and what we need to know becomes most consequential. The range of consequences behind Door 2 depends entirely on two variables, magnitude and precise location. These are not small variables. A magnitude SAR event in the Silver Springs corridor in the zone between Reno and Fallon, where the current swarm is concentrated, would be significant but survivable at the regional scale. The area is not the California urban corridor. It is not the Wasatch Front. The population density is lower, the infrastructure is less concentrated, and modern construction standards in seismically active areas are specifically designed with magnitude SAR events in mind. There would be property damage, there would be injuries, there would be the particular kind of regional trauma that comes from a major earthquake, the aftershocks, the structural assessments, the weeks of disruption while engineers inspect every building that felt the shaking. It would be a serious event. It would not be a catastrophic one. A magnitude BI event in the same location is a categorically different proposition. Each full unit on the magnitude scale represents approximately bar-high times more energy release. The difference between a SAO and a BI is not incremental. It is the difference between a bad day and a years-long recovery. A magnitude BI in the Silver Springs corridor would be capable of producing major structural damage across Reno, a city of nearly Hai-Trum-Bai-Mui, Combe people and Fallon, and the communities and infrastructure that connect them. Water systems, power grids, transportation networks. The economic disruption generated by a magnitude BI event in western Nevada would be measured in billions of dollars and years of reconstruction. And the human cost, which is harder to denominate but more important, would depend heavily on the time of day, the building stock, and how much warning, if any, the monitoring systems were able to provide. Here is the number that matters. A magnitude Bai-Phi Mui earthquake struck the Cedar Mountain Fault System in Mutngin Chintrum Bamihai. That system is structurally comparable to the fault network currently active near Silver Springs. The Walker Lanes historical record does not place a magnitude BI event behind Door 2 as a theoretical ceiling. It places it there as a demonstrated reality, documented in the geological record and in the seismographic archives of a sequence that looked, right up until December Haimimotst, like elevated but not extraordinary seismicity. Door 3, the regional cascade. Door 3 is the hardest to bound, the hardest to visualize, and the hardest to communicate because it is not a single event. It is a story. And like the Mutngin Chintrum Bamihai sequence, you cannot know you are in it until you are already deep inside it. A regional cascade in the Walker Lane fault system, a period of stress redistribution across interconnected fault segments, producing multiple large events over a compressed time window, would not announce itself as a regional cascade. It would announce itself as a large earthquake. And then, Weeks or months or years later, another large earthquake somewhere else in the system. And only in retrospect, looking back at the timeline, would the pattern become legible as a cascade rather than as independent events. This is exactly how the 1915 to 1950 Bourne cluster unfolded. The Pleasant Valley earthquake of 1915 was not recognizable at the time as the opening of a 40-year sequence of major Nevada ruptures. It was a large, damaging earthquake in a sparsely populated region. Cedar Mountain in 1915 was not immediately understood as the second chapter of that sequence. Fairview Peak and Dixie Valley in 1950 born two separate fault systems failing within minutes of each other, a double rupture that is still studied as one of the most striking examples of near-simultaneous cascading failure in the modern seismic record, only became recognizable as the culmination of a regional cluster in retrospect when someone laid the 3 decades of events on a map and noticed the pattern. The longer-term concern behind Door 3 is not the immediate event, it is the loading. When a major rupture occurs on a Walker Lane fault segment, it redistributes stress across the surrounding fault network. Adjacent segments that were already near their failure threshold get pushed closer. The Eastern California shear zone, which connects to the Walker Lane in its southern extent, has its own accumulated stress budget and its own history of major events. The Wasatch Fault Zone, at the eastern margin of the Basin and Range Province, sits at the far end of the stress corridor that the Wernicke hypothesis describes. A regional cascade, in the worst-case reading of the current situation, is a scenario where the Silver Springs swarm is not the story. It is the first paragraph, and the full story only becomes readable from the ending which, as with all seismological stories, has not been written yet. None of these 3 outcomes is certain. All 3 remain possible. The past 17 days of the Silver Springs sequence have not closed a single door. They have, if anything, made the hallway feel longer. The sequence is still choosing, and we are still waiting. Part Mui Tam. Signals that would change the picture. Let's talk about what seismologists are actually watching right now. Not in abstract terms, not in the language of academic caution, in the specific, operational, day-to-day terms of what the people monitoring the Silver Springs sequence are looking at every morning when they pull up the latest data. Because here is something worth understanding. The ambiguity between the 3 doors is not static. It is not a fixed condition that simply persists until the fault system makes its decision. The data has the potential to shift, not to resolve not cleanly, not with the kind of certainty that would satisfy a court of law or a public official weighing evacuation costs, but to shift, to move the probability distribution, to make one scenario more consistent with what the instruments are showing and another slightly less so. And there are specific signals, identifiable in advance, that seismologists have learned to watch for in sequences exactly like this one. These are not prediction triggers. I want to be precise about that, because the word prediction carries connotations in earthquake science that are both technically loaded and practically fraught. These signals do not constitute a warning system in the way that a tornado siren is a warning system. They are indicators, pieces of information that, if observed, would meaningfully update the interpretation of the sequence without eliminating any of the 3 possibilities entirely. Think of them less like an alarm and more like a change in the color of the sky, worth noting, worth taking seriously, not, by itself, a guarantee of what comes next. There are 3 of them. And understanding all 3, really understanding them, not just as abstract seismological concepts, but as living, real-time data streams that researchers are watching right now, is the closest thing to a practical answer this story has to offer. The first signal, maximum magnitude trend. The first signal is the simplest to explain and, in some ways, the most immediately legible, the trend in the maximum magnitude of the sequence over time. A background swarm, or a decaying aftershock sequence, has a characteristic magnitude signature. The largest events occur early or cluster around the initial triggering event and then the ceiling drops. The sequence keeps producing earthquakes, but the biggest ones get smaller over time, or at least stop getting larger. The energy at the top end of the distribution bleeds off. This is what stress release looks like from the outside, the system finding its ceiling and gradually respecting it. A foreshock sequence building toward a larger rupture sometimes, not always, but sometimes shows a different trend. The ceiling doesn't drop, or it creeps upward. A sequence that produced a numfei haimui last week produces a numfei barmui or a numfei bornmui this week. The top end of the magnitude range holds steady or climbs, rather than declining the way physics says it should if the system is simply unwinding. This upward creep is not proof of anything, but it is a meaningful departure from expected behavior, and it is exactly the kind of departure that prompts researchers to update their interpretations. For Silver Springs specifically, the 4 largest events in the sequence so far span magnitude Bornfei Baimui to Numfei Baimui, with the Numfei Baimui arriving on April Mui Bornth, and the subsequent large events Numfei Haimui, Bornfei Tammui, Bornfei Baimui, suggesting a rough downward trend at the top end. That is, by itself, not alarming, but the trend is shallow. The gap between the Numfei Baimui and the Numfei Haimui is small by Bath's law standards, and the Numfei Haimui arrived 17 days after the Numfei Baimui, which is not the decay rate of a sequence that is comfortably unwinding. If the next large event in this sequence is a num, bar or higher, that upward tick matters. It does not settle the question. It moves the needle. The second signal, spatial footprint. The second signal is geographic, and it requires you to think about the sequence not as a collection of individual events, but as a shape on a map that is either stable or changing. Right now, the Silver Springs seismicity is concentrated along a defined corridor, a narrow northeast to southwest trending zone in Lyon County that has been the consistent locus of activity since April Mooibornth. That geographic coherence is actually, in a counterintuitive way, somewhat reassuring. A sequence confined to a stable spatial footprint is consistent with a single fault system or a small cluster of interconnected fault segments processing stress within a bounded zone. It has a shape, it has edges, it is doing its thing in a defined area. What seismologists are watching for is whether that shape changes, whether the footprint begins to expand, whether earthquakes start appearing in areas of the regional fault network that were previously quiet, in directions that suggest the stress is migrating outward rather than being contained. This kind of spatial expansion is the surface signature of fault linkage, where rupture on one segment loads the tips of adjacent segments and progressively activates a wider network. It is also consistent with regional stress redistribution, with the system beginning to behave less like a single fault releasing its accumulated stress and more like a network finding new pathways for that stress to travel. The distinction matters enormously for the question of which door we are behind. A sequence with a stable, bounded footprint is more consistent with door 1, a self-contained swarm that will eventually exhaust itself within a defined zone. A sequence whose footprint is actively expanding is more consistent with doors 2 or 3, with either a building foreshock sequence on a larger fault segment or the early stages of a cascade in which stress is propagating outward through the Walker Lane network. And here is the part that makes this signal harder to act on than it sounds. Expansion can be subtle. It does not announce itself as a dramatic geographic jump. It looks, at first, like a few earthquakes slightly outside the previous cluster boundary. Then, a few more. By the time the expansion is unambiguous, by the time the spatial footprint has clearly and definitively grown beyond its previous boundaries, the stress redistribution that caused it is already well underway. The third signal, activity rate deviation. The third signal is mathematical, and it is the one that takes the longest to explain, but carries some of the most diagnostic weight. Every earthquake sequence has a temporal signature, a pattern in how frequently events are occurring over time. For aftershock sequences and background swarms, that pattern follows a well-established mathematical relationship called the Omoriotsu relation, named for the Japanese seismologist Fusakichi Omori, who first described it in Mutngin Tam Cham Chinmui Born and later refined by Tokuji Utsu in the mid-20th century. The relation describes how the rate of aftershock occurrence decays over time following a main shock. The decay follows a power law, not a straight line, not an exponential curve, but a specific mathematical shape that seismologists have observed to hold with remarkable consistency across earthquake sequences worldwide. What this means practically is that if you plot the rate of earthquake occurrence in the Silver Spring sequence over time and compare it to the Omori-Utsu prediction, you get a reference curve, a baseline for what a normally decaying sequence should look like at this point in its development, and then you look at what the sequence is actually doing relative to that baseline. A sequence that is tracking close to the Omori-Utsu curve rate declining in the expected shape is behaving like a normal aftershock sequence or background swarm. A sequence whose rate is flat when it should be declining is not releasing stress at the expected rate. Something is sustaining the activity, driving it at a level that simple stress relaxation does not predict. And a sequence whose rate is actually increasing where more earthquakes are occurring per day now than were occurring a week ago is showing the temporal signature of a system that is loading rather than unloading. That is the signal that concerns researchers most, because it is the temporal fingerprint most often associated with foreshock sequences in retrospective analyses of sequences that preceded major ruptures. The problem that won't go away. Here is where I have to be straight with you again, because these three signals, as real and as monitored as they are, come with a limitation that this entire story keeps returning to. By the time any of these signals is unambiguously present, by the time the maximum magnitude trend is clearly climbing, the spatial footprint is clearly expanding, the activity rate is clearly deviating from Omori-Utsu decay in a way that is statistically unambiguous and not just within the noise time may already be short. Escalation signals in foreshock sequences can precede the main shock by weeks or by days or by hours. There is no universal warning window written into the physics of fault rupture, the geometry of each fault system, the distribution of stress across it, the precise location and orientation of the eventual rupture. All of these factors influence how much lead time the precursory signals provide, and none of them can be read from the outside with sufficient precision to guarantee a useful window. This is the hard truth at the center of modern seismological monitoring. The tools are real. The signals are real. The researchers watching the Silver Springs data are skilled, experienced, and paying close attention. The lag between a signal appearing in the data and that signal being interpretable with confidence is shorter today than at any point in the history of the field. Shorter than in Mutngin Chincham Bamui Hai, when none of these analytical frameworks existed. Shorter than in Mutngin Chincham Bamui Lam, when Haicheng was predicted by pattern recognition and scientific intuition more than by formal statistical analysis. Shorter by years, by orders of magnitude of computational capability, by the entire accumulated progress of a scientific discipline that has spent decades trying to solve this problem. And shorter is not the same as zero. That gap, the distance between what the instruments can see and what the interpretation can confirm, is where the three doors still stand, identical and unmarked. The monitoring is happening, the signals are being watched, and the sequence, as of right now, has not yet committed to telling us which one it is. Part Mui Chin, the broader context. This is the part of the video where I have to be most careful. Not because the material is dangerous, but because it sits directly on the boundary between legitimate scientific inquiry and the kind of pattern matching that sounds compelling and leads nowhere good. And on this channel, that boundary matters. We cross into fringe territory sometimes that is part of what Project Nightwatch is for, but we cross it with our eyes open, and we always tell you where the solid ground ends and the speculation begins. So let me draw that line clearly before we start, and then let's walk right up to it together. The Silver Springs sequence is not occurring in a vacuum. During the same general time window as the Nevada swarm, two other things happened that are worth acknowledging, not because they explain what is happening in Lyon County, and not because they prove anything about connected systems or external triggers, but because intellectual honesty requires naming what is in the broader picture, even when the picture does not resolve into a clean story. The Taiwan event. On approximately the same date range as the Silver Spring swarm, a magnitude numfei Tammui earthquake was recorded near Taiwan. Taiwan sits on one of the most seismically complex and hazardous tectonic boundaries on the planet, the collision zone between the Eurasian plate and the Philippine Sea plate, a convergent boundary where subduction and collision are occurring simultaneously in a geologically complicated configuration that produces frequent seismicity across a wide magnitude range. A numfei Tammui near Taiwan is, in the context of that region's seismic background, a notable event, but not an extraordinary one. Taiwan experiences dozens of magnitude num and above earthquakes every year. Its building codes, early warning systems, and emergency response infrastructure have been shaped by that reality over decades of hard experience. So why mention it at all? Because the question of whether large tectonic systems can influence each other across oceanic distances, whether a stress adjustment in the Philippine Sea plate system can somehow communicate itself to the Walker Lane belt in Nevada, is a question that exists in the scientific literature, even if it does not have a clean answer. The concept of global seismic triggering, in which the surface waves from a very large earthquake travel around the entire planet and trigger seismicity in geographically distant fault systems, is documented. It is real. The High Ninle High Denali earthquake in Alaska triggered seismicity as far away as Yellowstone. The High Ninle-borne Sumatra earthquake, one of the largest ever recorded, produced detectable seismicity changes across a significant portion of the global fault network. But, and this is a large but those documented cases involve extremely large earthquakes, typically magnitude Bi-Fi Nummui and above, generating surface waves with enough energy to transiently perturb distant fault systems to a magnitude num. Tam near Taiwan does not generate that kind of global surface wave energy. The seismic waves from a numfei Tammui attenuate with distance. By the time they reach Nevada, the energy is negligible far below the threshold at which dynamic triggering has been documented in the literature. The Taiwan event and the Silver Spring sequence are almost certainly independent expressions of the normal background seismicity of two very different tectonic environments. The timing is coincidence in the statistical sense, two active regions doing what active regions do during the same 2-week window, which is not a surprising thing to observe on a planet where tectonic plates are moving continuously and seismicity is occurring somewhere at all times. I mention it not because I think it is connected. I mention it because you will see people online connecting it, and you deserve to know what the connection actually requires to be real and why it almost certainly is not. The geomagnetic storm. This one is more interesting and more complicated, and I want to spend some real time on it because it touches something that this channel takes seriously. The genuinely contested edges of geophysics, where the mainstream consensus is clear, but the question is not fully closed, and where the difference between responsible skepticism and reflexive dismissal matters. During the same general period as the Silver Spring swarm, Space Weather Monitoring Services recorded a minor geomagnetic storm, a GMOT event on the NOAA scale, the lowest of 5 categories of geomagnetic disturbance, caused by a coronal mass ejection from the Sun interacting with Earth's magnetosphere. A GMOT storm is common. They occur dozens of times per year during periods of moderate solar activity. At the GMOT level, the documented effects are limited to minor fluctuations in power grid voltage at high latitudes, slight orientation errors in satellite navigation systems, and enhanced aurora visibility at higher latitudes. It is, by space weather standards, a background event, and yet the question of whether geomagnetic activity at any level influences earthquake occurrence is one of the genuinely contested edges of geophysics. Not fringe, not settled, contested, and I think that distinction deserves more than a dismissive wave. There is a body of research exploring correlations between solar activity, geomagnetic fluctuations, and seismicity. Some of it is published in peer-reviewed journals. Some of it is considerably more speculative. The proposed mechanisms span a fairly wide range of physical ideas. One class of hypothesis involves electromagnetic effects on fault-zone fluids, the idea that changing magnetic field conditions could influence the behavior of electrically conductive fluids in fault zones, potentially altering pore pressure in ways that affect fault stability. Another class involves piezoelectric responses in crystalline rock quartz-bearing rocks. Under stress can generate electrical charge when that stress changes, and in principle, external electromagnetic perturbations could interact with that process. A third, more speculative line of research looks at ionospheric anomalies, changes in the ionosphere detected before some major earthquakes, as possible indicators of stress-related electromagnetic emissions from the crust below. None of these mechanisms has been demonstrated with the rigor that would support a predictive claim. None of them has been validated in a prospective, controlled way, meaning that no one has successfully used geomagnetic conditions to predict a specific earthquake before it happened, had that prediction independently verified, and then replicated the result. The mainstream scientific consensus is that the evidence for a causal solar seismic link is insufficient, and that the correlations observed in some studies are likely artifacts of the statistical challenges inherent in comparing two complex time series, seismicity rates, and geomagnetic activity, each of which has its own internal structure, its own cycles, its own noise sources, and its own tendency to produce apparent correlations with other time series that do not reflect real physical connections. That is the honest assessment. That is where the science stands. But I want to push back gently on one thing, because I think it matters for how we think about questions like this. The absence of a demonstrated mechanism is not the same as a demonstrated absence of mechanism. These are logically different claims, and conflating them is a mistake that cuts both ways. Science that is fully certain of its own borders has usually stopped exploring at least one of them. The history of geophysics is not short of examples where a proposed mechanism was dismissed as physically implausible, not enough energy, wrong timescale, no plausible pathway, and then later found to be real, operating through a mechanism that was not considered in the original dismissal. Reservoir-triggered seismicity, wastewater injection earthquakes. Both were contested before they were accepted. Both had mechanisms that seemed marginal until they were shown, through accumulating evidence, to be real. I am not saying geomagnetic activity triggers earthquakes. I am saying the question is not as closed as the dismissive version of the consensus implies, and that the researchers who are actively working on this question in peer-reviewed literature are not cranks. They are scientists working at a genuinely hard edge of observational geophysics, where the signal-to-noise ratio is low and the statistical challenges are formidable, but where the question itself is legitimate. What I am saying clearly, unambiguously, without hedging, is this. The Guillemot storm that occurred during the Silver Springs swarm window does not explain the Silver Springs sequence. The tectonic explanation for what is happening in Lyon County, Nevada, is complete without any reference to space weather. The Walker Lane belt is loaded with accumulated stress from decades of plate motion. The fault system currently active near Silver Springs has a documented history of producing anomalous sequences. The statistical signature of this swarm the Bath's law violation, the spatial coherence, the persistence of activity is entirely consistent with the internal dynamics of a tectonically loaded fault system doing what tectonically loaded fault systems do. No external trigger is required, no solar wind needed. The Earth is perfectly capable of generating this sequence entirely on its own, from the inside out, for reasons that have nothing to do with what the Sun was doing last Tuesday. The geomagnetic context is worth noting. It is worth noting precisely because this channel takes seriously the questions that mainstream science is still working through, and because the absence of certainty is not the same as the absence of interest, but it does not change the primary story. The primary story is underground, in the brittle crust of the Walker Lane belt, in the accumulated stress of 72 years of tectonic loading on a fault system that has, in the past, produced magnitude 7 earthquakes without a great deal of advance warning. That story does not need help from the sun to be worth paying attention to. It is already more than enough. Part Haimui Final Thought. We started this story at Mort. Mui Bai in the morning on May Motst. Hainginle Haimui Sao with a magnitude numfei Haimui earthquake near Silver Springs, Nevada. One event, one seismogram lighting up in the high desert of Lyon County, while most of the region was asleep, unremarkable on its face. A 5-point something in Nevada, logged and moving on, and then we pulled back, and we kept pulling back, until the single event became a sequence of 440, until the sequence became a pattern, until the pattern became a historical echo, until the echo became a question that has no clean answer, and won't have one until the fault system decides to provide it. Let me walk you through everything we covered, because it deserves to be held together before we reach the end. We travelled from that single seismogram through the geometry of the swarm, the northeast to southwest lineation of earthquake hypocenters clustering along a fault corridor in the brittle crust between 5 and 10 kilometers down at the depth where rock is rigid enough to store stress for decades and release it in seconds. We looked at the statistics of anomaly, the Bath's law violation, that puts the largest aftershock in this sequence 5 times more energetic than expected, the B value sitting at or below the threshold that suggests a stress regime already primed at the high end of the magnitude range. We went underground, through the architecture of the Walker Lane Belt, a fault system twice as wide as the San Andreas, accommodating a quarter of all North American plate motion, essentially invisible to public awareness despite being one of the most structurally significant tectonic features in the continental United States. We stood in central Nevada, in Motngin Chin Tram Bamuihai, and watched a sequence unfold in real time, which is to say, we watched it the way the scientists of that era watched it, without the analytical tools to recognize what it was, logging moderate earthquakes in a region that produces moderate earthquakes, not understanding until December, Haimui Motst, that the preceding months of activity had been the ground organizing itself for something larger. We did the arithmetic on the 72-year silence that followed the last major Nevada rupture in Motngin Chin Tram Namui born the Dixie Valley earthquake, the second half of a double rupture that remains one of the most striking examples of cascading fault failure in the modern seismic record, and we sat with the honest uncertainty about what that silence means. Reloading or relaxed? The data does not currently answer that question. It holds both possibilities open simultaneously. We examined the 3 doors. Background swarm, most statistically likely, resolving quietly into the archive of notable but benign Nevada seismicity. 4-shock sequence, the scenario that keeps researchers professionally wakeful, with consequences ranging from a damaging magnitude 6 to a potentially catastrophic magnitude 7 in a corridor where by tram, Combe people live within 100 kilometers of the current activity. Regional cascade, the hardest scenario to bound, the one that looks like a single event until it becomes a chapter in a multi-decade story, the one that only becomes legible as a cascade when someone lays the timeline on a map and notices what the pattern was trying to say all along. We looked at the signals that would shift the picture upward: creep in maximum magnitude, expansion of the spatial footprint, deviation from Omori Utsu, decay in the activity rate, and we confronted the limitation that runs through all of them. By the time each signal is unambiguous enough to act on, time may already be short. Shorter warning window is not the same as no warning window, but it is also not the same as enough. And now we have arrived at the same place the seismologists watching this sequence have arrived. The place where the data is real, the pattern is real, the history is real, and the interpretation is still, genuinely, open. I want to sit with that openness for a moment, because I think it deserves more than a resigned shrug. The openness is not a failure of science. It is not a failure of the monitoring systems, or the researchers, or the analytical frameworks that modern seismology has developed over a century of trying to understand why the ground moves the way it does. It is the current honest state of one of the hardest problems in observational science, the problem of reading a system that is larger than any individual measurement, older than any historical record and more complex than any model yet devised. The gap between what we can observe and what we can know is real, and it is not a gap that closes simply by adding more seismometers or running more sophisticated algorithms, though both of those things genuinely help at the margins. It is a gap that exists for a more fundamental reason. The Earth does not organize its behavior around our need for predictability. It never has. The fault beneath Silver Springs does not know that we have seismographs pointed at it. It does not know that we have Barth's law, or Coulomb stress modeling, or the Omori-Utsu relation. It does not know that by Trum, Hong people live within 100 kilometers of its current activity, people with houses and families and infrastructure, and lives built on the assumption that the ground beneath them is a platform rather than a participant. The fault knows only stress and friction. It knows the physics of crystalline rock compressed under enormous pressure, loaded by the slow, indifferent grinding of tectonic plates against each other at rates of millimeters per year. It knows whether the accumulated force pushing its two sides past each other has exceeded the resistance holding them in place. When it has, it slips. When it hasn't, it doesn't. The seismogram is a one-way window. The data flows out. Nothing flows back in. The fault does not consult the record before it makes its decision. In 1932, a pattern unfolded that was, in retrospect, entirely recognizable. The magnitude clustering, the persistence past expected decay, the spatial coherence of the activity along a defined fault corridor. After December Heimumotst, after the ground opened along 5 kilometers of fault line on the winter solstice of that year, the sequence looked obvious. It looked like something that should have been caught. And in the most important sense, it could not have been, not with the tools available, not with the conceptual frameworks that existed, not with the monitoring network that was in place. The scientists of 1932 were not negligent. They were working at the frontier of what the discipline could do, and the frontier was not far enough. In Heinginlehr a pattern is unfolding that is, in the most important ways, recognizable right now, not in retrospect, in real time. The tools are better. The monitoring is denser and faster and more analytically sophisticated than anything that existed when Cedar Mountain tore open 94 years ago. The scientific frameworks, Barth's law, Coulomb stress transfer, the Wernicke corridor hypothesis, Omori-Utsu analysis are fully developed and actively being applied to this sequence as it unfolds. The researchers watching the Silver Springs data are not flying blind. They are flying with the best instruments the discipline has ever produced. And the honest answer to the question of whether that is enough, whether recognizing the pattern in real time, knowing the history, having the tools, watching the signals, the honest answer is, we don't know yet. That answer is, in a certain light, the most frightening thing in this entire video, more frightening than the Barth's law violation, more frightening than the Mortngin Chin Trum Barmui High parallel, more frightening than the 72-year silence or the 3 doors or the regional cascade scenario, because all of those things are data points. They are specific and bounded and arguable. The we don't know yet is structural. It is baked into the nature of the problem. It is the answer that every seismologist working on this sequence will give you, not because they haven't tried hard enough, not because the monitoring is inadequate, but because the system they are trying to read is older and more complex than the tools used to read it, and the resolution to that gap has not yet been found. We have mapped the fault, we have measured the earthquakes, we have read the history written in the fault scarps, those long linear steps in the Nevada landscape where the ground offset itself along rupture lines that are still visible a century later, the geological equivalent of a scar that never fully fades. We have built models that capture the physics of stress transfer and fault linkage and magnitude frequency distribution with precision that would have seemed miraculous to the seismologists of Mtngin Chin Trum Balmehai. And we are still, in May, of Heinginlehr Heimusau, standing in a hallway in front of 3 identical doors. The sequence will choose. It always does. That is not fatalism, it is physics. The fault system will resolve the ambiguity on its own schedule through its own internal process, in the way that fault systems have always resolved ambiguity, by either slipping or not slipping, by either producing the next event or going quiet, by either confirming the pattern or refusing it. The only question is which choice it makes and when. If it chooses door 1, the sequence fades, the activity decays, the Silver Springs swarm gets archived alongside the High-in-Lair Tam Reno swarm and every other anomalous Nevada sequence that resolved without rupture, and the Walker Lane belt returns to its baseline of restless quiet. The 3 doors close, the hallway empties, and somewhere in Lyon County, the instruments keep running, watching the next sequence begin its slow accumulation. If it chooses otherwise, if the high desert of western Nevada decides, as it decided on December Haimimotst, Mutnginchintram Bamihai, that the accumulated stress of decades has found its moment, then the pattern that is recognizable right now will become, in retrospect, one of the clearest precursory sequences in the modern record. The data will not have changed. The frame will have changed. The fault will have provided, as it always eventually provides, the context that makes everything that came before it legible. The ground we stand on is not a platform. It never was. It is a participant ancient, indifferent, operating on a timeline measured in millions of years, carrying a memory that no seismogram has yet learned to read in full. It always arrives on its own schedule. We are still waiting to find out what this one's schedule is.